The tractor sat at the back of Walter Morrison's junkyard on the edge of Hutchinson, Kansas, half buried in weeds, one rear wheel missing, hood rusted through in 3 places. It was a 1947 Farmall H. 28 years old in the summer of 1975. Walter had taken it in trade for some welding work 2 years earlier from a farmer who said it was too far gone to bother with. And for 2 years it had sat there, collecting rust, becoming home to field mice, slowly sinking into the Kansas dirt like it was trying to bury itself. Then, on a Saturday afternoon in July of 1975, a young man named Kenny Marsh walked into Walter's yard with a $100 bill in his pocket and a problem nobody thought had a solution. Kenny was 23 years old. He'd just gotten married 3 months earlier to a girl named Linda who worked at the bank in town. He'd saved up $3,000 working construction and odd jobs, and he'd found something nobody expected a 23-year-old with no farming background to find. Land. 40 acres on the south edge of Reno County, not prime ground. The soil was sandy. No buildings except a collapsing chicken coop, no house, no well, just 40 acres of marginal farmland that the bank had repossessed when the previous owner died, and the heirs didn't want it. The bank wanted $2,800 for it, cash only, no financing available for raw land with no improvements. Kenny had $3,000, which meant after buying the land, he'd have $200 left to somehow turn 40 acres of sand into a farm. Most people would have said it was impossible, that you needed at least $10,000 in equipment to farm even small acreage, that you needed experience, that you needed family connections, that you needed luck. Kenny just needed a tractor, and standing there in Walter Morrison's junkyard, looking at the most pathetic piece of farm equipment he'd ever seen, Kenny saw something nobody else had seen in 2 years. He saw possibility. "How much for the Farmall?" Kenny asked. Walter looked at him like he was joking. "That thing, it's junk. Hasn't run in 3 years. Missing a wheel. Engine's probably seized." "But how much?" Walter shrugged. "Give me $250 and it's yours. But you're buying it as is, no refunds when you figure out it's worthless." Kenny thought about his $200, thought about the 40 acres he'd just bought, thought about Linda, who'd trusted him enough to believe they could make a life farming land everybody said wasn't worth farming. $250 is more than I've got," Kenny said. "What if I give you 100 now and 50 more in 30 days? Walter studied him, saw something in this kid's face that made him curious. "You really think you can make that thing run?" "I know I can." "Why?" "Because I don't have a choice. Either I make it run or I can't farm. And if I can't farm, I just spent everything I have on land I can't use." Walter smiled. First genuine smile he'd had all week. "Tell you what, give me 100 now. You get that tractor running and show me it works. I'll forgive the other 150. Kenny blinked. "Why would you do that?" "Because if you can bring that piece of junk back to life, you deserve to keep the money. And because I like a kid who's desperate enough to try impossible things." They shook hands. Kenny paid his $100, and Walter Morrison watched as this 23-year-old kid with no farming experience and no equipment hooked a chain to a tractor that hadn't moved in 2 years and dragged it home behind a borrowed truck. Everyone who saw it thought Kenny Marsh had just thrown away his last $100. They were wrong. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand something. This isn't a story about a tractor. This is a story about what happens when someone with nothing to lose meets a challenge everyone else has given up on. This is a story about resourcefulness, determination, and the kind of obsessive problem-solving that turns junk into equity. If you want to hear how a $100 gamble turned into a paid-off farm and a 20-year legacy, hit that subscribe button right now, because what you're about to hear will change how you think about starting with nothing. Let me tell you what Kenny was working with in July of 1975. The 1947 Farmall H sat in the dirt beside his 40 acres. No shed to work in, No proper tools, no service manual, no experience rebuilding tractors. What Kenny did have was a library card and a willingness to learn. He went to the Hutchinson Public Library and checked out every book they had on small engine repair, tractor maintenance, and international harvester equipment. He read them at night after work, took notes, drew diagrams. Then he started taking the Farmall apart. The missing rear wheel? He found a replacement at a salvage yard for $12, worn and weather-cracked, but it held air. The rusted hood. He hammered it flat where he could, patched the holes with metal he cut from a junked washing machine, and painted the whole thing with implement paint he bought with money from returning aluminum cans. The engine? That was the real problem. Kenny pulled the spark plugs and found 3 of the 4 cylinders full of water. The head gasket was blown, the valves were stuck. The oil in the crankcase looked like coffee grounds mixed with metal shavings. A mechanic would have said the engine was trash, would have quoted $1,500 for a rebuild. Kenny didn't have $1,500. He had determination and library books. He pulled the head himself, spent 3 days with sandpaper and a flat piece of glass getting the head surface perfectly flat, so it would seal. He soaked the valves in diesel fuel and worked them by hand until they moved freely. He pulled the oil pan and found metal fragments from a thrown rod bearing, but the crankshaft itself was still good. He couldn't afford new bearings from a dealer, so he measured everything carefully, took the measurements to a machine shop, and asked what they had lying around that might work. The machinist found some industrial bearings that were close enough, charged Kenny $8 for them. Kenny installed them himself, filed them carefully to fit, assembled the engine by hand, torquing every bolt to specifications he found in a library book. Total invested in parts, $63. Time invested, 4 weeks of evenings and weekends. On August 23, 1975, Kenny filled the Farmall H with oil, gas, and water, set the choke, spun the crank. The engine coughed once, twice, then caught. Blue smoke poured from the exhaust for the first minute, then cleared. The engine settled into a rough but steady idle, and Kenny Marsh stood there in the Kansas heat, covered in grease and dirt, listening to the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. An engine that everyone said was dead, running. The next day, Kenny drove that tractor to Walter Morrison's junkyard. Walter heard it coming from 100 yards away, came out of his shop wiping his hands, stared at the Farmall H putting down the road like it had every right to be there. Kenny pulled into the yard, shut it off, climbed down. "I'll be damned," Walter said. "Still runs rough. Needs some tuning, but it runs." Walter walked around the tractor, saw the hammered hood, the patched metalwork, the mismatched paint, the rear wheel that didn't quite match the other 3. "Kid, that's the ugliest tractor I've ever seen." Kenny smiled. "But it works." Yeah, it does." Walter pulled out his wallet, handed Kenny $50. "You earned this back, that other 100 you owe me? Forget it. You got that thing running with pocket change and library books. That's worth more than money." Kenny tried to refuse the 50. Walter insisted. "Take it. Buy parts. You're going to need them." "Let me stop here and ask you something. When was the last time you looked at something everyone else had given up on and saw potential? When was the last time you bet everything on your ability to figure something out?" Drop a comment, because Kenny Marsh did exactly that, and it changed his entire life. That fall, Kenny farmed his 40 acres for the first time. He couldn't afford to buy a plow, so he found a rusted 2-bottom at an auction for $25, spent a week rebuilding it, replacing worn parts with pieces he fabricated himself or found in junkyards. He couldn't afford seed, so he talked to farmers at the co-op, offered to help with their harvest in exchange for whatever wheat seed they'd give him. He couldn't afford fertilizer, so he didn't use any. Just worked the ground as best he could and planted wheat in September. The Farmall H pulled the plow, pulled the disc, pulled the drill Kenny borrowed from a neighbor. It ran rough, it smoked sometimes, it leaked oil. but it worked. That winter, Kenny worked construction during the week and maintained his tractor on weekends, adjusted valves, replaced worn parts, learned the machine inside and out. By spring, the Farmall was running better than it had when he'd first gotten it started. And in June of 1976, Kenny harvested his first crop. 40 acres of wheat on sandy ground with no fertilizer didn't produce much. His yield was maybe 15 bushels per acre, 600 bushels total. At wheat prices that June, that was about $1,400 gross. After seed costs and fuel and the custom cutting he'd hired, Kenny netted about $900. $900 from land everyone said wasn't worth farming. Using a tractor everyone said was worthless. Kenny took that $900 and paid it directly against his land note. He'd financed the difference between his $3,000 and the $2,800 purchase price at his wife's bank. $500 at 12% interest. After that first year's payment, he owed almost nothing on the land. But more importantly, he'd proven something. He'd proven that starting with nothing wasn't the same as having nothing. That resourcefulness could substitute for capital. That determination could overcome disadvantage, and he'd proven that the Farmall H, the tractor nobody wanted, the $100 gamble that everyone said was throwing money away, was the most valuable asset he owned. The years that followed established a pattern. Every season Kenny farmed his 40 acres, wheat in the winter, sometimes soybeans or milo in the summer if moisture was good. He kept his costs minimal, did all his own work, maintained the Farmall himself. And every year, without fail, that 1947 Farmall H started up and worked. Pulled the plow, pulled the planter, pulled the equipment Kenny slowly accumulated through auctions and salvage yards. 1977, Kenny bought a grain drill for $50 and rebuilt it. The Farmall pulled it. 1978, he found a hay rake for $30. The Farmall pulled that too. 1979, he added a small hay baler he got for $100 at a bankruptcy auction. The Farmall powered it. Every piece of equipment was old, every piece was cheap. Every piece required Kenny to rebuild or repair it before it would work. But every piece, once fixed, did its job, and the Farmall pulled it all. By 1980, 5 years after buying that tractor for $100, Kenny had turned his 40 acres into a functioning small farm. He was netting about $3,000 a year. Not a fortune, but steady income, reliable income. Income that let him and Linda save money, pay cash for equipment, avoid debt. His neighbors farmed bigger, had newer equipment, made more money in good years. But Kenny had something they didn't: complete financial security, zero debt, zero vulnerability to bad years or market crashes. Here's what I need you to understand about this, and this is critical. Kenny wasn't succeeding because he was a better farmer. He was succeeding because he'd eliminated the main thing that destroys farmers: fixed costs during variable income years. His tractor was paid for. His land was nearly paid off. His equipment was cheap enough that if it broke, he could fix it or replace it without taking on debt. If this is making sense, if you're starting to see why Kenny's strategy was brilliant, hit that like button and share this with someone who's trying to start something with limited resources. In 1983, something happened that tested everything Kenny had built. A drought hit Kansas, the worst in 20 years. Wheat yields across the county dropped by 60%. Farmers who'd planted hundreds of acres expecting 25 bushel yields got 8 or 9. Kenny's 40 acres, on sandy ground that was marginal in good years, produced almost nothing, maybe 3 bushels per acre, 120 bushels total. At 1983 prices, that was about $400 gross income. After costs, Kenny broke even. No profit, no loss, just survival. His neighbors, the ones farming bigger with newer equipment and high overhead, had catastrophic losses. Equipment payments they couldn't make, operating loans they couldn't service, Some of them lost their farms that year. Kenny lost a year of profit, that's all, because his overhead was so low, because his equipment was paid for, because his land was paid off. Breaking even wasn't a crisis. It was just a year to get through. And the Farmall H? It kept running, pulled Kenny's plough through that dry, hard ground, used minimal fuel, required minimal maintenance. That year, Kenny realized something important. The tractor that nobody wanted, the $100 gamble that everyone mocked, wasn't just helping him farm. It was protecting him, giving him resilience, creating a buffer between his operation and the economic forces that were destroying other farmers. By 1985, 10 years after buying the Farmall H, Kenny owned his 40 acres free and clear, every dollar of the original note paid off. The land was his, completely and permanently. That same year, he bought another 20 acres adjacent to his original 40. Paid cash. $1,500 for land the bank was desperate to unload after another foreclosure. 60 acres now, all paid for, all farmed with the same equipment he'd been using for a decade. The Farmall H was now 38 years old. It looked terrible. The paint was faded and patchy. The seat was held together with duct tape. One headlight didn't work. It burned oil. It leaked hydraulic fluid, but it ran. Every time Kenny turned the key, it started. Every time he needed to pull something, it pulled. Kenny had rebuilt the engine twice, replaced the clutch once, gone through the transmission, put new tires on all four wheels, rewired the electrical system, replaced the radiator. Total invested over 10 years, maybe $1,200 in parts and materials. A new tractor would have cost $20,000 and required financing. Kenny's investment in the Farmall, $1,300 total, including the original purchase. That's the math that let Kenny buy land while his neighbors were losing theirs. In 1990, 15 years after that Saturday afternoon in Walter Morrison's junkyard, Kenny was farming 90 acres. All paid for, all profitable, all worked with equipment that averaged 30 years old, and the Farmall H was still the heart of his operation. It was 43 years old now, a tractor that should have been retired to a museum or scrapped for parts, but Kenny had kept it alive through knowledge, maintenance, and refusing to give up on it. His sons, Kenny Jr. and Mark, had grown up on that farm, had learned to drive on that Farmall, had helped their dad maintain it, rebuild it, keep it working. One evening, Kenny Jr., who was 15, asked his dad a question. "Dad, why don't we get a newer tractor? Something that doesn't leak oil and smoke." Kenny was under the Farmall at the time, replacing a rear seal. He slid out, sat up, looked at his son. "This tractor cost me $100 in 1975. Since then, it's helped me pay off 40 acres, buy another 20, then another 30. It's pulled every implement we own. It's never quit on me when I needed it. And it's never cost me a payment to a bank. But it's old. Old isn't the same as worthless. This tractor has earned its place here. It's paid for itself 100 times over, and as long as I can keep it running, it's staying." Kenny Jr. thought about that. "What happens when you can't fix it anymore? Then I'll find another tractor nobody wants and make it work, because that's what we do. We take things other people have given up on, and we make them valuable." Now I want to hear from you. What's the thing in your life that everyone says isn't worth keeping? What's the project or the tool or the vehicle that people tell you to replace, but you know still has value? Leave a comment, because Kenny Marsh proved that what other people call junk can be the foundation of everything. By 1995, 20 years after buying the Farmall H for $100, Kenny Marsh owned 140 acres of paid-off farmland. All of it purchased with cash. All of it farmed with equipment he'd bought cheap and maintained himself. All of it made possible because he'd started with a tractor nobody wanted and refused to believe the people who said it was worthless. The Farmall H was 48 years old, still running, still working, still starting every morning when Kenny turned the key. It wasn't the only tractor on the farm anymore. Kenny had bought two others over the years, both used, both cheap. But the Farmall H was still the one he used most, still the one he trusted. That fall, the local newspaper did a story about Kenny, about the young man who'd started with nothing and built a farm that had survived when so many others hadn't. The reporter asked Kenny what his secret was. "No secret," Kenny said. "I just bought things I could afford, maintained what I had, and never took on debt I couldn't pay off in a single good year." "But you started with a $100 tractor that didn't run." "Best $100 I ever spent. That tractor taught me everything I needed to know about farming. It taught me that maintenance beats replacement, that knowledge beats capital, that something old and reliable is worth more than something new and financed." The reporter wrote that down, then asked one more question. "Do you still have that first Farmall?" Kenny pointed across the yard to where the H sat, faded and worn, but ready. "Still runs, still works, still don't owe anybody a payment on it." The Farmall H finally retired in 2003, 56 years after it rolled off the assembly line. Kenny had owned it for 28 years. It had been the foundation of everything he'd built. Kenny didn't scrap it, didn't sell it. He restored it completely. Proper paint job, new seat. Fixed everything that leaked or smoked or rattled. Then he parked it in a shed he built specifically for it, and he put a sign next to it that read, 1947, Farmall H purchased 1975 for $250, paid for 140 acres of land. Never missed a season, never had a payment, never quit. Kenny Marsh is 72 years old now. Still farms his land, though his sons do most of the work. The operation has grown to 200 acres, all paid off, all profitable. They run modern equipment now. Tractors from the 1990s and 2000s, all bought used, all paid for in cash, all maintained meticulously. But that 1947 Farmall H still sits in its shed, preserved and honored. Every spring, Kenny fires it up, lets it run for a few minutes, makes sure everything still works. And he tells his grandchildren the story of how their family farm was built on the back of a tractor nobody wanted. "This machine," he tells them, "cost less than a tank of diesel costs today. But it bought our land. It created our security. It gave us freedom. Everyone who saw it in 1975 thought I was a fool, thought I'd wasted my last $100, but that tractor was the smartest investment I ever made, not because it was valuable, but because I made it valuable through work and determination. Remember that. Value isn't just about what something costs, it's about what you do with it. So let me leave you with this. Right now, there's something in your life that everyone tells you isn't worth it. A project that seems too far gone. A goal that seems impossible. A dream that seems unrealistic. But Kenny Marsh proved that impossible is just another word for nobody else had the determination to figure it out. He bought a $250 tractor in 1975 that no one wanted. A machine everyone said was junk. A gamble everyone said would fail. 20 years later, that tractor had paid off his land and built a legacy that's now spanning 3 generations. Not because the tractor was special, but because Kenny refused to believe the people who said it was worthless. If this story inspired you, if it changed how you think about starting with nothing and building something real, do 3 things. First, subscribe to this channel for more stories about people who succeeded by seeing value where others saw only junk. Second, drop a comment telling me, what's your $250 Farmall? What's the thing you're working on that everyone says isn't worth it? Third, share this with someone who's trying to start something with limited resources, someone who needs to know that starting with nothing isn't the same as having nothing. Kenny Marsh bought a tractor for $250 that nobody wanted. 28 years later, it had helped him build a 140-acre farm worth over $500,000. All because he understood that value isn't what something costs. Value is what you make it become. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next